No właśnie.
Ona jest na platformie. Tam, póki co nie widziałem tam za dużo materiałów, ale to jest taka wprowadzająca prezentacja, która została zaktualizowana w oparciu o nowych członków.
Ja na platformie chyba nie mam.
Chyba nie. To myślę, że nie potrzebujesz.
Tak się zawsze będzie działo. Albo na to wyjdzie do wtedy.
Proszę, nawigacja.
Vous avez un computer?
Comment?
Vous avez un computer?
Ici?
Non, on a un computer.
Ah non, non, j'ai pas le droit.
Ah oui, c'est vrai.
J'ai le droit d'être aucun réseau.
Non.
C'est-à-dire pas plus. Parce que l'Académie du renseignement, j'ai une habilitation au secret défense.
Ah oui, d'accord. Ah oui, oui. Ah oui. Voilà. Non, parce que moi, je pense que c'est professeur. Hein.
Ah non, non, mais je suis professeur de l'Académie du renseignement.
D'accord, ok.
C'est dans les locaux de l'école militaire. Plus constamment en contact avec les gens des services.
Oui, je comprends.
Théoriquement,
Là, oui.
Théoriquement, je vais demander l'autorisation de partir à l'étranger. Je le fais. J'enseigne en Chine, je leur dis, il y a un problème, non, non,
I would like to introduce Inspector Krzysztof Jarmusz, the head of the Łódź Detachment of Anti-Terrorist Police.
Quand je vais en Russie ou en Chine, dans les pays même en Chine, on donnait accès quand même à des choses. Par exemple, là où je suis l'Académie de police, Shenyang. Et je crois régulièrement, avec un collègue, parce qu'il est il faut envoyer son collègue. Et la réponse mettait 6 mois à arriver. La véritable patronne de l'Académie, c'est-à-dire la numéro 2, celle qui représente le parti. Elle dit pourquoi représentant de commissaire politique, commissaire politique,
Okay, Szanowni Państwo, zaczniemy. Ladies and gentlemen, we can start our conference. I would like to warmly welcome all the guests and especially panelists, our superstars, our guests from France and Finland and Polish panelists as well. It is a huge privilege to host you here at the University of Łódź, the Faculty of Political and International Studies, University of Łódź. We are having the pleasure to host all of you and be a place when you can listen to the interesting exchange of ideas and visions of the future as well. I guess we can just wait for other people to enter, and then I will continue. I would like to introduce the panelists of the first panelist just in a minute, that talk a couple of words about their background, but it's a huge pleasure to host you here. I'm the dean of this faculty, Ryszard Machnikowski, and I will be also a moderator of the very first panel, and I will deliver a very short, don't be afraid, speech on the legacy of Cassandra in a minute. But of course, I think that you can just join our discussions. The panel will be divided into the presentation of our panelists, and then we will have an exchange between us, and then we will still have some time for questions and comments from the public. So please be active if you have any questions or comments to whatever you could hear. Here is it will be our responsibility to try to respond and to answer these questions. Thank you very much for all people who are involved in organization of this event, for Secretary of Conference, Mr. Piotr Ciach, for Mr. David Grzelak, our computer guy who is responsible for good connection. And I'm really very happy that we can meet you here, hopefully not the first time, but we will organize this event as a kind of a continuous event also next year and so on and so on. I will tell you a couple of words about the center, because this is the Center of Analysis, Strategic Analysis and Forecast. It is a kind of a unit which is devoted to providing expertise to the external world. Perhaps some people who are involved in academic life here knows that we are evaluated, and the so-called the third criterion of evaluation is providing expertise to the external world and having impact, having influence over external world. So the center was established under my direction to provide the workforce for these contacts with external world. I guess that it's going to be quite a successful institution, and we strongly encourage you to contact us if you want to get some expertise in some important international relations and political issues. I have to say, and I have to stress that we have also our special guests from Polish Financial Supervision Authority, which is Urząd Komisji Nadzoru Finansowego, Inspector Michał Stępiński and Mr. Andrzej Szmajdziński. And we have also a guest from Łódź Police, the commander of the Polish Łódź anti-terrorist unit, Inspector Krzysztof Jarmusz, which is easily recognizable here because he's in uniform. So thank you everyone for coming here, and I will just tell you a couple of words about Cassandra and her life, because it is quite an interesting myth in Greek mythology. I would tell a couple of words about the life of Cassandra, especially for younger generation, because my generation, well, is pretty familiar with Greek mythology. I don't know how youngsters are. Cassandra was a daughter of King Priam of Troy and Queen Hecuba, and she was the fraternal twin of Helenus and sister to Hector and Paris. And probably you know this story about Trojan horse, so it is very much connected to this story. Cassandra was admired for her beauty and intelligence by the god Apollo, who sought to win her with the gift to see the future. And this gift turned into some kind of a curse, because she refused Apollo, and as a result he cursed her, and her ability to foresee the future was turned into kind of a nightmare, because nobody actually believed her prophecies. Before the fall of Troy took place, Cassandra foresaw that if Paris goes with Sparta and brings Helen back as his wife, the rival of Helen will spark the destruction of Troy during the Trojan War. Ignoring Cassandra's warning, Paris still went to Sparta and returned with Helen, which started the Trojan War, which ended tragically for the Trojans, as we all know it. Moreover, Cassandra warned the Trojans about the Greeks hiding inside the Trojan horse, Agamemnon's death, her own death at the hands of Aegisthus and Clytemnestra, her mother, Hecuba's fate, Odysseus' 10-year wandering before returning to his home, and the murder of Aegisthus and Clytemnestra by the latter's children, Electra and Orestes. Cassandra predicted also that her cousin Eneasz would escape during the fall of Troy and found a new nation in Rome. God's gift, but curse was working. Nobody was believing all these prophecies. At the fall of Troy, Cassandra was abducted and raped by Ajax and was taken as a Phalaic concubine by King Agamemnon of Mycen. Various sources state that Cassandra and Agamemnon had twins boys, Teledamus and Pelops, who were also murdered by Aegisthus. While he was away at war, Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, had taken Aegisthus as her lover, and Cassandra and Agamemnon were later killed by Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. What are the moral of this interesting myth? Of course, we have many incarnations of this myth. Many Greek authors were relating to this myth, so we have different versions of this myth, but still the core is more or less the same. First, individual and personal moral is that those who can more or less correctly predict or see the future will live tormented life ended with violent death. So this is not a very optimistic kind of moral. The second moral, communal, is that this erroneous thinking leading to catastrophic decisions having grave consequences for the whole society should be the legitimate subject of scientific scrutiny and research. This is a research question, actually. Why the politicians, because Cassandra was not a politician, she was given this gift, but why the politicians, the king of Troy, the advisors followed the wrong path, the path of catastrophe, in fact. We have many tools in our intellectual arsenal, psychological, sociological, social psychology, to make the explanation of these meticulously pre-planned policies leading to obvious catastrophic results researched by the academia. Why? Because the story of Cassandra refreshes itself in modern times. This myth is a good metaphor of situation taking place in modern times. We know all of this. And shows that true wisdom may be openly neglected and purposefully ignored, like Cassandra's wisdom. If we consider that sometimes researchers may arrive, because some researchers may arrive at right conclusions, still politicians deliberately ignore these right conclusions and their expertise and stubbornly make the same mistakes again and again. Just to provide you with the most recent example, the foreign policy of our neighbor, which was based on the partnership with Russia, is now in disarray. And still in some countries, there is a belief that making partnership with totalitarian or authoritarian regimes are leading to good consequences. No, they will not. I can tell you for sure, as a kind of a Cassandra, today that being involved in partnership with totalitarian and authoritarian regimes doesn't matter what geographical place is leading inevitably to catastrophe. In foreign policy, to catastrophe of sometimes war, military conflict, or whatever. And we can tell it just before things are going to happen. So this is the kind of moral which we can say today. The case of Western policies generally towards Russia is definitely masterly good illustration to this, and sadly I must stress that in many places no lessons has been learned again. This ignorance and persistence in pursuing wrong policies is an amazing thing, but at least partially can be explained by the structural impossibility of politicians' mind to understand certain things in their complexity, which is determined culturally. So we should divide personal stupidity, to put it in this way, straightforward, and obstinacy from cultural inability to comprehend vastly different things. Because this is a skill. We need to develop this skill, to understand how different entities, political entities, cultural entities are perceiving the world. It is a kind of a skill which we should develop to make expertise working. If we cannot find this perception of the world, which is vastly different from ours, and ours are not actually the only one, we are living in a very multicultural environment, we will have huge troubles with conducting policies, conducting politics, conducting international and foreign policy, and just trying to foresee what is going to happen. But some predictions are pretty obvious, I must admit. So, just to conclude, I think that this myth, the old ancient Greek myth of Cassandra, is a kind of a guiding light for today's Cassandra, trying to say something about not only the present and the past, but also about the future. And we must praise for the politicians to listen to this expertise, because otherwise we will simply do all the time the same mistakes, which is not optimistic, but I must say should be also the legitimate subject of research. There is a very few academics who are actually interested in answering this question, why politicians are repeating their mistakes again and again and again, why they do not learn these lessons. So I think that it might be a kind of a start of a ponderance and scientific scrutiny over these things, which I would like strongly to propose here. During this conference, I think that we are going to talk about the past, and here Timo Hellenberg is waiting for his part, about the future, Xavier Raufer, and about the contemporary things. I would like to introduce the panelist of the very first panel here, Mr. Timo Hellenberg from Finland, distinguished historian, the founder and director of the Hellenberg International, a very important and interesting figure in Finnish academic and political life. Mr. Xavier Raufer, if I may say, well, you are both my friends. I consider you my friends, so I'm really very much emotionally touched upon that I can just host you today. Xavier is one, or if not the best specialist, criminologist, best specialist in radicalization organizations and terrorist organizations, not only in France, but also in the international environment, a very distinguished person in French academia with a huge experience in many areas of the world. Mr. Piotr Grochmalski, I hope we will have Piotr Grochmalski as our panelist, but I'm not sure because his situation is unstable due to some personal problems, so please forgive if he could not be our guest. And last but not least, Dr. Andrzej Anders, who is going to talk about this perception, Asian and Chinese perception of the world. Welcome, all of you, and we can start with Timo Hellenberg's presentation. Timo, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Professor Ryszard Machnikowski. Ryszard is a good friend of mine, and it's a great privilege to be here today. My topic is pathway to war in Ukraine, and I promised to the other panelists that I will stick with the 15 minutes which was given to me. My first contact with Ukraine took place in the late 1990s when I was working at Helsinki University almost 2 decades. And we were organizing a seminar about EU enlargement and Ukraine. And that time, of course, the idea of the Ukrainian future as part of the European Union was only in our mindset as a distant constellation. But nevertheless, we felt that it is an important topic, and we were much motivated to consider this option in the future. I have been privileged to live in Kiev for 4 years and to make observations at the citizen level. I have worked in roundtables between the NATO Civil Preparedness Unit and Ukrainian administration. And when Maidan started, from my account, it started actually in mid-October 2013, I had a chance to stay there the full time, 2 months, and to make observations. I was also privileged to co-write this book, Battle for Ukraine, Eyewitness Testimony. I have a few pictures from that time. And for instance, this picture, which you can now see, is taken 18th of February at the Institutska Street. It's about 100 meters from Parliament, and it was 12 o'clock, and you can imagine it was quite hot there at that time when I took this picture. 10 minutes before taking this shot, there were people, young girls, giving flowers to the Interior Ministry Special Forces who were sitting on this vehicle. So the atmosphere was completely different, and suddenly the sky broke down and everything changed. Next slide, please. Ukraine and Russia are our topic today. 2 countries that are historically linked to each other through strong connections, religious, cultural, economic connections. Families from Kharkiv to Belgorod are often strongly intertwined with common Slavic roots. On February 24th last year, Moscow sent its army, enhanced with international mercenaries, to Ukraine and began to destroy the country, its infrastructures, its religious places systematically. However, to understand what is happening now in Ukraine, I think we just need to look the longer history, 1,300 years history, which has been the bond between these two nations, two countries. Both countries, Russia and Ukraine, traced their beginnings to the same medieval empire called Kievan Rus, founded by the Vikings, Varganians. Kievan Rus extended to present-day Russia and Ukraine and its people, the Slavs, and the ancestors of today's Russians and Ukrainians are pretty much the very same. The ancient capital was the city of Kiev, and Moscow, the capital of present-day of Russian Federation, was also part of this same entity. It's worth to remember that Ukraine is a massive country. It's the second largest country in Europe and the seventh largest with a population of almost 50 million people. It should also be remembered that Ukraine has existed with its current borders since the World War II. It was until 1954 that Crimean Peninsula was annexed to Ukraine, and three regions of Western Ukraine, which we very well know, Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, Ternopil, were annexed only after the Second World War, having previously belonged to Poland, even before that to the dual monarchy. Transcarpathia was also annexed to Soviet Union only just before World War II. So a lot of things happened during that time period. And Ukraine gained its independence, of course, in 1991 from the Soviet Union. Like Finland, Ukraine is a border country. Both have been autonomous before their independence. On the other hand, while Finland's autonomy continued for 200 years, in Ukraine it was cut very short, drastically. The historical parallels between Finland and Ukraine culminate also to the very drastic events. The Battle of Poltava, 1709, and Battle of Raatte Road, Raatteen tie, like we say in Finland, in 1940. When presidential elections, as we very well remember, in 2004 were held, neither the pro-Western Viktor Yanukovych, supported by Russian-speaking regions, managed to collect more than half of the votes. So the situation was blocked politically, and it was very difficult for the country's internal politics. Orange Revolution was a new normal at that time, at that stage. After the elections in 2004, Yushchenko's prominent ally Yulia Tymoshenko was appointed as the Prime Minister of Ukraine. These were the drastic times of Ukrainian new independence, and this was a critical moment to which pathway the country would proceed. However, soon after, these orange forces started to drift into mutual conflict, and Tymoshenko's government was sacked in September 2005. Soon after, in March 2006, at the parliamentary elections, Yanukovych led his party of regions to the victory, and it became the largest party in the country. 2008, Ukraine, like many other Eastern European countries, was plunged in a very serious economic crisis. And of course, this gave the opportunity for the neighboring countries to intervene. In 2010, President Yanukovych was re-elected. And as a first step, the president worked with Russia on so-called peace process. He started to work with Russia, the peace process, like he called it. And under the Kharkiv agreement, there was the deal with the Russians to lease the Crimea until 2042. So Ukraine gave a possibility for Russian fleet to continue leasing the Crimean Peninsula, and in turn to receive a discount for the gas prices. So it was the win-win deal from Yanukovych's perspective. In June 2010, Ukraine decided to abandon the NATO membership aspirations. However, Ukraine continued bilateral cooperation, including with the United States, naval exercises, and to deepen the bilateral relations. I recall that time, which has not been stated publicly, but there were a lot of exercises between Ukraine and the United States. For instance, the air forces were practicing together in Ukrainian airspace. In December 2010, Tymoshenko and former Interior Minister Yuri Lutsenko were put on trial on charges of misusing the state funds, and Tymoshenko was soon sentenced to 7 years in prison in October 2011. Again, very drastic events and very critical moments in Ukrainian modern history. Next slide, please. Let's go back to the EU and Ukraine association agreement. The European Union and Ukraine has been negotiating the association agreement for the long time, and at that time, and there was a comprehensive strategic level agreement which included the free trade agreement for 5 years. The agreement was said to bring Ukraine into the EU single market. And of course, like you see from the map, the country was at that time quite divided. Whether there were forces on anti-government, pro-European Union, like you see in the red here, or in the green you can see pro-government, anti-European Union. So of course that time the government was Yanukovych's government. Despite the bumpy road, the agreement looked promising, and it was pre-sealed in the spring of 2012, but soon after that the situation got worse. In August 2013, Russia began to make increasing use of tariff restrictions, food regulations, and by the end of the day, the trade between Ukraine and Russia became very difficult, and that had a very drastic effects on Ukrainian domestic economy. Ukrainian leadership started to speak about in favor of association agreement at that moment, and from the Brussels perspective, everything looked promising. The association agreement was due to be signed in Vilnius meeting at the EU-Ukraine summit in November 2013. And as you remember what happened on November 21st, 2013, the government of Ukraine officially decided to abandon the preparations for signing this very important association agreement between the EU and the government of Ukraine. This U-turn was, of course, huge disappointment for the West, but even more for those Ukrainians, particularly younger generations, who had put all the hopes for the fact that Ukraine would become the full member of the European Union in the short period of time. We all remember, of course, what happened soon after that. The last days of November 2013, the special forces, the Berguts from the Interior Ministry of the Ukraine, decided to clear up the central square of Maidan from the citizens, and they used the heaviest possible force that was at their disposal. I was there at that time, and I remember the city was turning to the kind of medieval atmosphere of Middle Ages. People were escaping to the Mikhailov monastery, and the bell ringer was ringing the bells. And according to his own comments, this had last happened in 1240s when the Mongols invaded the Kiev. So the situation was quite chaotic and dark at that situation. Next slide, please. Here is the timeline. Unfortunately, the text is pretty small, but I hope it helps a little bit to understand the timeline of the critical moments in that time period, starting in end of November 2013 and ended up to the escape of President Yanukovych from Kiev during the last week, which was 20th of February 2014. I would just like to conclude to bring up a few critical issues which I would like to reflect in my short introduction. On 17th of December 2013, Ukraine and Russia, soon after abandoning the association agreement, signed 14 different agreements. Russia offered its assistance with a loan of $15 billion, as well as a promise to reduce the import price of the natural gas. There was a lot of speculation in the air whether President Yanukovych had already secretly signed the customs union agreement with Russia at that time. Soon after, the Maidan started to become violent. First casualties, actually 3 first casualties were foreigners, started to emerge, and the spiral of revenge started to emerge. By mid-January 2014, in a very undemocratic procedure, the majority of the Ukrainian parliament passed a law which stated that all the NGOs in the country receiving foreign funding should be registered, and it was a so-called foreign agent law, so we all know what that means. That was a huge misjudgment from the Ukrainian government at that time. And the situation was spiraling very quickly towards the revenge, towards the violence, and a radicalism was emerging on both sides of the Maidan barricades. There were different type of fractions like Spilna Sprava, Nazis. There was violent fractions from the Berkut side, and that was impossible to stop this spiral of violence at that time. Next slide, please. Situation was critical, of course, and I estimated that approximately 300 people, in fact, lost their lives during the Maidan clashes, during these 2 months clashes. And of course, we know the Heavenly 100, the people who are officially listed as those people who lost their life during the last week of the mass shootings. But altogether, roughly 300 people have been losing their lives during this demonstration, which started as a peaceful demonstration, but turned it to the most violent clashes in the city center. I would like to, as a last point, I would like to raise one very important day. That was the 13th of January 2014. So the last day of January, when the first president of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk, came to media and he made a speech at the parliament. He stated that this is his most important speech of his life. According to him, the country was on the verge of the civil war. The protests had already turned into revolutionary or most violent spiral. And according to Kravchuk, the atmosphere was catastrophic. He stated that both the government and opposition should look to the mirror. There's no space for ambitious thinking. The country is at the brink of the civil war. But nobody listened. I remember that time when first president of Ukraine made this very important speech, but nobody listened. And my question today for the other speakers and also for the audience is that could the crisis in Ukraine at that time, before the actual war started, would have been resolved peacefully at that moment, the end of January 2014? I would also very much like to consider that what was the role of the Western intervention, because the West, Europe, United States, we also offered exactly the same amount of funding for Ukraine, $15 billion. But the characteristics of this funding package were unclear. So where the money would have come, what would have it included, and what would have been the obligations for the Ukrainian government. Soon after, of course, the February, we know what happened. The situation was critical. Friday, 21st of February, Vitaly Klitschko presented the negotiation agreement at Maidan, which had been negotiated with the help of foreign ministers from France, Germany, and Poland for the long time. The major powers, these three countries, had been discussing this package agreement. It had been introduced for the president, Yanukovych, and the leaders of opposition. However, the Maidan people disagreed. And the president escaped during the next night, and we know what happened. So this was the last moment to stop this violence and to stop this spiral of violence. And in order to save the time for the other speakers, I would like to stop here and maybe to continue at the later stage. And just to ask the other speakers and the audience that could West have been performed more effectively at this moment? And what went wrong? This is my question today. For current assessment, I will give my comments at the later stage. Thank you.
Introduction, historical introduction. And now we can explore this question and go to the future as well. Yes, you have a question, but maybe we will do it during the question answer sessions. Yes, if it is possible. Okay, because let's give the panelists the chance to perform, and then we will open the discussion. So please, Xavier, the floor is yours.
From here?
Yes, sure.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ryszard, for inviting me. A warm salute for my colleagues in the University of Paris, and personal souvenir. When I was young, I attended a pre-military school for paratroopers regiment, and we had songs to sing during this military training. And one of the songs dating from Napoleonic era was a homage to the Polish cavalry in Napoleon's army. So you can see that our cooperation on these strategic domains is very old and very ancient. But we will not discuss about the past now, but about the future, and about the most important thing that one should be able to do in a world where everything is quick, where you can go from Warsaw to the other end of the earth in 15 to 20 hours, when information is instantaneous. You can be informed now with mobile phone of what is happening around the planet at the very minute. So we have, at the strategic level, governments have a necessity of early detection of threats and early reaction. What is now the nightmare of each and every head of the general staff, Minister of Defense, Minister of the Interior, Prime Minister, or President, is the strategic shock. Something that would like what happened to the United States at 9/11. Suddenly, your world explodes and everything is changed and you have to react immediately. This necessity to anticipate is not recent. The first time ever in the history of the Western world. When we had this necessity was during World War II. It was in 1939, 1940, before the United States entered the war in 1941 after what happened in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor. But early on, the war had already started in Europe, and Britain was suffering hugely of the bombing of the Luftwaffe, of the German army. And of course, as at that time, United States were neutral, they couldn't give any weapons to London, to the British army. But asked the Prime Minister, Churchill, maybe they could help them to anticipate the move of the bombers to help the anti-aerial artillery of the British. Because if you can detect which will be the next move of a bomber in the sky, you can, of course, shoot it easily. And at that time, the United States gave the best and the brightest of all the mathematicians and all the physicists in the United States. Some of them participated later on in the creation of the nuclear bomb, the first atomic bomb. And very quickly, those scientists discovered that after maybe 2 minutes, you enter the realm of uncertainty. And uncertainty at that time, they discovered, cannot be modelized. You cannot model uncertainty. What we do now in terms of anticipation is totally fictitious. If you take events from the past and you project them in the future, that is not anticipation, that is wishful thinking. It doesn't help at all. So maybe in a distant future, when we have other form of computers, other capacity to calculate things much more quickly than we do now, maybe something can be done in this direction, but to this day, we are in the same situation as the anti-aerial artillery of the Brits in 1940, when it was absolutely impossible to anticipate the move of a plane after 2 minutes, and the shells of the anti-aerial artillery took 4 minutes or 5 minutes to reach the altitude where the planes were flying. So it was absolutely useless. You have so the difficult situation in which uncertainty cannot be modelized. It is impossible, for instance, to say this has happened and this has happened, and we collect all the data possible, which was at some times something the Google, Amazon, etc. bragged they could do. They talked about predictive policing, for instance, which is absolutely a fraud. It is not possible to say that this has happened in this part of the city yesterday, so it will happen again tomorrow. That is nothing else than, nothing more than wishful thinking. What can we do? This is projecting data from the past into the future has no scientific value. If it was true, if projecting things from the past could be truly a warning sign of something in the future, everybody could win the lottery. You can take all the numbers winning in the past and project them in the future, and you are the next winning number. Sadly, that is not possible, and that don't even try, it doesn't work. And for instance, too, knowing each and every terrorist attack from antiquity to the 10th of September 2001 couldn't help at any moment to guess that the next day, the worst terrorist attack in the world history, more than 3,000 people died, would happen the next day. So we cannot look at the future and look in the past and project it in the future. To this day, it is a total impossibility. A lot of people have tried this, and the chances of success in such a situation are exactly like tossing a coin, you know. One chance it works, the other it doesn't. But what we can do, and this is what we do in our working group, we try to watch some powerful trends that could become subjects in the future. Looking at the noise of all the events happening simultaneously in the world at one moment and try to select in them some elements that could be important in the future, where already, for instance, the work and the activity of intelligence could be concentrated on those trends. Instead of looking at 100%, 360 degrees, you can concentrate on the part so you can look more deeply, more profoundly in one direction than in one another. For instance, to give you a concrete example, once I was in Washington, I was in front of the State Department where I had a conference, and in front of the State Department, they had these huge blocks of granite, you know, stone. And they say, why did you put that here? It said, well, it's again the possibility of a suicide attack, like with a car, when you throw a car in a building. I said, have you an idea what is in the Islamist regulations about those suicide bombings? They can only happen in the land of Islam, because you cannot, suicide is forbidden by Islam. You can only sacrifice your life if it's in the defense of Islam on the Islamic territory. That is, for instance, you can do that in Beirut, you can do that for instance, in Saudi Arabia or in Libya. You cannot do it except in very precise circumstances. It's forbidden to do it on what they call Dar al-Harb, the war, the country where the war is legal. So it is not possible. So why do this? You can concentrate on looking after terrorist attack and suicide attack in some place of the world, but not in the 200 countries of the United Nations. This is an example of looking selectively to one situation, one point, one territory, and not all the time everywhere. So what are now for us in France and in Western Europe the two big preoccupations that we have for the future, where I think we should concentrate our attention and look at maybe the strong signals instead in the middle of the general noise. The first is this is about, we think about two geographic areas. The first area is the Carpathian chain of mountains, crossing all of Eastern Europe from Poland to even to Serbia, but easternwards to Romania. Since the Roman Empire, this part of Europe has never been under the control of anyone. Even the Ottoman Empire could not control it. Last week, we arrested in Paris some guys with 400 kilos of methamphetamine, which is a huge quantity. And already this huge quantity of drugs were coming from a place, some place along the Romanian and Ukrainian border where there is no high mountains, deep valleys, not a lot of human beings, and already in this part of the Carpathian area, you have laboratories for drugs, you have fabrication of counterfeit cigarettes, Marlboro, etc. And this is now more and more coming to Western Europe. This is a criminal problem. This is not a strategic problem. But imagine that tomorrow, whatever the resolution of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, you will have young men, you will have a lot of weapons, you will have people losing a war and not happy about that. And this could become, in this part of an area that is the Carpathian chain of mountains, which is 200,000 square kilometers wide. It's bigger than the Alps. So you see, in this area, a lot of uncontrolled territories, a lot of weapons, a lot of young men not happy about the way the war, whichever wins or loses, it's not the problem is not there, could lead to a situation with guerrillas, with terrorism, etc. And the second preoccupation is even wider. It is the future fate of the Black Sea in 2030 or 2030 or 2050. Why? Because this is ultimately where the one belt, one road superhighway for Chinese goods will arrive in Europe. And if we have a situation where Russia controls part of the Black Sea, Turkey controls another part of the Black Sea, and China lands a lot of economic or goods or industry or finances, it will be a huge problem for, at least for Western Europe, because we will be strangled. So those are our two preoccupations. And when some people in the French government ask our advice and say, what should we look at in the future? Those are the two directions. For us, we believe for the time being that terrorism and Islamic terrorism is not such a great threat as it was 10 or 20 years ago. We remember that we had in Europe a lot of anarchist terrorism before World War I. But when the real war started, anarchist terrorism disappeared. Also, during World War II, before World War II, we had a lot of terrorism in Western Europe, specifically in France, coming from the Balkanic area. We had the Ustashi, we had the revolutionary Macedonian Revolutionary Organization. They even killed the king of Yugoslavia in Marseille, in the south of France, in 1935. But when the real war started, with guns, with regiments, with tanks, with the army, this terrorism was wiped out. So now we have a real war close from here, with tanks, with guns, with artillery, with what? And we do not think that in such a situation, Islamic terrorism will have a great activity in the coming times. One reason about that, in this situation of war, the president of Turkey, Erdogan, wishes to have a statute of arbiter between the two parties. And now, what is left of the Islamic State, what is left of Al-Qaeda, all of them are in a part of Syria that is under the control of the Turkish special forces, of the Turkish intelligence. Today, the last thing Erdogan would wish is a wave of terrorist attack coming from an area under his control, because he wishes to be a super arbiter between Eurasia, on Russia and Ukraine, etc. So this is the reason why we would advise our people in France to, of course, continue looking at terrorism, because nothing is 100% sure, and you can have loose cannons, so to say, that can take an opportunity, but put the maximum of the observation capacities on first all the illicit stuff coming from this zone area of Carpathian, which is not really under the control, 100% control of any state that has the capacity to enforce the law and order in this area. For instance, we know that to this day, 4 or 5 trucks full of counterfeit cigarettes come each week from this part of Europe to Southern Europe, mainly to Italy. And one truck, a big truck full of counterfeit cigarettes, the profit of one truck is 2 million euros. And each week, 2, 3, 4 of these trucks coming from this area through Slovakia mainly, 2,000 euros. So who does control this contraband? Where does the money go? This is important because with money you can have weapons, etc., etc. So this is the first preoccupation we have, this area, gray area under no real control. And second, what could happen if the Black Sea, so important for the future of Europe, it was under the control of people that mostly are now hostile, that is Russia, China and Turkey. So these are our preoccupations, and if possible in the future, I will answer your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we can go to professor Piotr Grochmalski. Dziękuję bardzo, panie profesorze, że zechciał pan do nas zajrzeć chociaż online. Sytuacja jest taka, że ja będę starał się przetłumaczyć główne wątki z wypowiedzi pana profesora, który będzie prezentował po polsku. Także bardzo proszę dawać mi od czasu do czasu trochę czasu na rekapitulację tych głównych myśli. Dziękuję bardzo.
I'm so sorry. I will be speaking Polish. Przewidziałem wybuch tej wojny i fakt, że Federacja Rosyjska ugrzęźnie na obszarze Ukrainy. W związku z tym należę naprawdę do wąskiego grona analityków, którzy ze znaczącym wyprzedzeniem przewidzieli rozwój wydarzeń dotyczących agresji Rosji na Ukrainę, a także przebiegu tej wojny.
Professor Grochmalski is one of very few Polish and not only Polish analysts who predicted pretty clearly the chain of events which led to war between Ukraine and Russia. And so basically, if we can analyze the majority of stuff written there, it is a kind of an exception for the majority of expertise in this area.
Z Rosją zajmuje się jeszcze od czasów Związku Sowieckiego, od czasów agresji Związku Sowieckiego na Afganistan. Uczestniczyłem w kilku konfliktach, które Rosja prowadziła, w tym wojnie przeciwko Czeczenii. W związku z tym pewna tendencja związana z rozwojem Rosji była czytelna od praktycznie pierwszej czeczeńskiej wojny.
Stems from the fact that Professor Grochmalski was analyzing, and not only analyzing, but also participating in conflicts which were run by Russia, Afghanistan in 1979 and Chechnya, the first Chechen war. So this is the basis for this prediction.
W związku z tym cały kierunek polityki Putina wskazywał na to, że to będzie prawdopodobny kierunek rozwoju Federacji Rosyjskiej, a więc próba restauracji czy odbudowy rosyjskiego imperium.
This restoration of Russian Empire was pretty clear in this respect if we consider the whole of the Putin's policies towards the foreign entities.
W tej chwili nie czas na to, aby Państwu to udowodnić, ale już decyzje, które Putin podjął tuż po tym, jak został wybrany na prezydenta po wyborach prezydenckich w roku 2000, wskazywały na długofalowe cele Rosji i długofalową strategię Putina.
Even these early decisions which Putin undertook after election in 2000 as a president of Russian Federation was also a kind of a significant sign that for the long-term goals of Russian foreign policy.
I tutaj ja się nie zgadzałem z ogromną większością analityków, która twierdziła i nadal część tych analityków tak postrzega działania Putina, że nie ma tam ciągłości strategicznej.
So here is a kind of a discrepancy and some kind of refusal of point of view of other analysts who were saying that there is simply no strategic continuity in the activities of Russian president.
Trzeba zwrócić uwagę, że już w pierwszym roku Putin podjął bardzo agresywne działania przeciwko podmiotom narodowym, czyli republikom autonomicznym na obszarze Federacji Rosyjskiej. To jest ogromna grupa republik, począwszy od republik kaukaskich, ale także takich 5 podmiotach, które są położone bardzo blisko Moskwy.
During the first year of his tenure at the helm of Russian Federation, he conducted many activities directed towards not only Caucasian but other Russian republics, which were just showing his intentions.
Dzisiaj takie postacie jak Gerasimow są kojarzone przede wszystkim z rosyjskim imperializmem. Pamiętajmy, że to jest jednak właśnie obywatel jednej z takich republik autonomicznych, który jest jego życie kształtowane było właśnie w takiej formule tradycji lokalnych i tradycji imperialnych.
Even figures like Gerasimov are usually associated with Russian imperialism, but we should understand and remember that he is a citizen of this autonomous republic, and his life was structured and created by the living in this place.
Urodził się w Kazaniu, a więc stolicy Republiki Tatarstan. Tatarzy są drugą narodowością w składzie Federacji Rosyjskiej.
He was born in Kazan as a citizen of Tatarstan Republic, and Tatars are the second largest minority in Russia.
To samo dotyczy Szojgu. Szojgu jest urodzony na Dalekim Wschodzie, w Republice Tuwie. To są ludzie kształtowani w tym dylemacie Rosjanie i ludność nierosyjska.
Also Shoigu, who was born in the deep east of Russian Federation, was also living and growing under this dilemma of Russians versus non-Russian citizens of Russian Federation.
Po rozpadzie Związku Sowieckiego obszar zajmowany przez różnego rodzaju autonomie narodowe obejmował terytoria łącznie w granicach 59% całej Rosji, a więc stanowiły one bezwzględną większość ziem Federacji Rosyjskiej. Mówimy o republikach i okręgach autonomicznych Federacji Rosyjskiej.
After the demise of the Soviet Union, these lands formed 59% of the Russian Federation, so it is at most majority as far as land is concerned. We are talking about the republics and different administration, autonomous administration in Russian Federation.
I to jest ten jeden z czynników, który cały czas traktowany był jako możliwość dalszego rozpadu Federacji Rosyjskiej, a więc po tym rozpadzie Związku Sowieckiego przejście w fazę rozpadu czy też degradacji Federacji Rosyjskiej.
And this factor was considered to be an important factor in possible transformation, not only from the phase of dissolution of the Soviet Union, but also the dissolution and demise of the Russian Federation itself.
W tej chwili ta kwestia narasta, z jednej strony szowinizm rosyjski, a z drugiej strony wykorzystywanie podczas tej wojny w ogromnym stopniu ludności takich republik jak Baszkorstan czy Czeczenia, Inguszetia, Kabardyno-Bałkaria, Tatarstan.
And on the one hand, we can see the rise of chauvinism, Russian chauvinism, but as well we can also see this issue of using ethnic minorities in the fight against Ukraine during this war.
Rosja też prowadzi w tej chwili bardzo agresywną politykę ruszyzacji okupowanych obszarów ukraińskich.
And of course, Russia is conducting very aggressive policy of Russicization of these conquered territories.
Na tym tle pojawiła się foreign policy, koncepcja młodego analityka Dalibora Rochacza dotycząca przyszłości Ukrainy i Polski.
And considering this, we should also focus our attention on foreign policy article of young analyst Dariusz Rochacz, who is trying to foresee the future of Ukraine and Ukrainian state.
It's time to bring back the Polish-Lithuanian Union. Tytuł tego artykułu wiele wyjaśnia. Autor próbuje zastanowić się, próbuje analizować, na ile możliwe jest dzisiaj odbudowanie konfederacji lub też formy Unii Ukrainy i Polski.
The title of this article, which you had already known, is just exploring the possibilities of some kind of a rebuilding of a Polish-Lithuanian Confederation and this territory which was used to be under the control of First Rzeczpospolita.
Nawet dzisiaj w świadomości Polaków mało znana jest ugoda chadziacka z 1658 roku, która ustanawiała przekształcenie Rzeczpospolitej obojga narodów w Rzeczpospolitą trzech narodów, a więc właśnie korony Litwy i księstwa ruskiego, na którą składało się większość ziem ukraińskich.
And even today we do not remember 1658 umowa, well, a kind of Hadziacka agreement, which was establishing not only the republic of two nations, but the republic of three nations, including the territories which is currently Ukraine.
Autor nie wspomina tej ugody, ale rzeczywiście był to kluczowy moment, jeśli chodzi o rozwój wydarzeń i historii tej części świata.
Although the author is not recalling this agreement, still it is a very important factor till today in understanding the issues here.
Autor zastanawia się nad kwestiami dwoma kluczowymi dla bezpieczeństwa całego tego regionu i przyszłości Ukrainy. Po pierwsze, szybkie wejście Ukrainy do NATO, po drugie, szybkie wejście Ukrainy do Unii Europejskiej.
So the author explores two critical issues considering the future of Ukraine, possible membership in NATO and possible membership in the European Union.
Przypomnijmy, że to stanowcze weto Niemiec, Angeli Merkel w 2008 roku wobec ambicji Gruzji i Ukrainy doprowadziły w istocie do tej sytuacji, z którą mamy do czynienia. Niemcy wtedy w sposób stanowczy, bardzo agresywny, co zaskoczyło ówczesnego prezydenta Stanów Zjednoczonych Busha, przeciwstawiły się otwarciu NATO na Ukrainę i na Gruzję.
But we can consider that Angela Merkel's veto in 2008 staged towards Georgia and Ukraine this membership, prospective membership, which was a surprise for George W. Bush, President of the United States, was a kind of a major cause for the situation we can witness today.
To powoduje, że można spodziewać się, iż droga Ukrainy do NATO będzie dużo bardziej wyboista niż na przykład obecna droga Szwecji do NATO.
So we should expect that the Ukrainian path to these institutions, European institutions and transatlantic institutions might be much more difficult than today's Sweden's accession to NATO.
A przecież to są sytuacje nieporównywalne pod żadnym względem.
But these two situations are completely different.
Dlatego autor proponuje, aby zastosować właśnie taką metodę rozwiązania tego tylnymi drzwiami.
The author proposes to find the solutions to this problem, but from the backward.
Twierdzi, że jest to realistyczna wizja i za przykład daje zjednoczenie Niemiec.
And he claims this is realistic, and as an example, there is a unification of Germany in 1991.
To jest jedyne połączenie, jakie miało miejsce na obszarze Europy od wydarzeń związanych z upadkiem komunizmu.
And this was, of course, I'm talking about Germany. This was the only and unique kind of event since the fall of communism in 1991.
Dzięki ustaleniom zawartym wówczas między Kohlem a Gorbaczowem, Niemcy Wschodnie w bardzo szybkim tempie weszły w struktury NATO, a także w ówczesną wspólnotę europejską.
Due to Kohl-Gorbachev talks and agreements, eastern part of Germany entered NATO and Western economic community in a very short way.
Autor przy tym zwraca uwagę, że ta konfederacja czy Unia polsko-ukraińska nie byłaby prostą kalką owej integracji niemiecko-niemieckiej.
But of course, this confederation of Poland and Ukraine would not be a kind of just a repeatment of what happened with two German states.
Po pierwsze, oba państwa powinny zachować swoją tożsamość i strukturalną samodzielność.
They should be independent, structurally independent, and of course the identity, cultural identity should be held.
A po drugie, skala gospodarczych i socjalnych problemów powinna być opłacana, czy powinna być obciążona przez Unię Europejską, a nie przez Polskę. To nie Polska powinna finansować złożony proces integracji z Unią Europejską, ale te pieniądze po części powinny być pieniędzmi z tych 300 miliardów zamrożonych rosyjskich pieniędzy plus środki Unii Europejskiej.
And this integration should not be financed by the Polish state only, but mainly by the European Union. All this money, $300 billion, which are just taken from Russian assets in Europe, just to finance this process.
Autor ma świadomość, że ten projekt jest wysoce złożony i może napotkać na cały szereg problemów, trudnych problemów do rozwiązania. Tym niemniej rzeczywiście jest to koncepcja, która w stosunkowo szybki sposób mogłaby przełamać opory tak zwanej starej Europy.
The author is aware of all the complexities and difficulties which might be on this path to integration, but this is, according to him, the easiest way to break the positions of so-called old Europe, which is against such an integration of Ukraine with.
Opiera się ona na historycznej wspólnocie państw tego regionu. Autor podkreśla, że mimo złożonej, trudnej historii, jego zdaniem więcej Ukrainę łączy z Polską niż z Rosją.
And this is based on some kind of historical links and historical community of Poland and Ukraine, which is much closer now with these links which are linking Russia and Ukraine. Panie profesorze, jeśli można,
tak?
Parę minut jeszcze nam zostało.
Oczywiście. Z tej koncepcji, nawet jeśli byłoby to trudne, aby zintegrować w ten sposób Ukrainę z Unią Europejską, to z pewnością koncepcja wejścia tylnymi drzwiami do struktury NATO wydaje się bardzo atrakcyjna i to w krótkim czasie zwiększyłoby bezpieczeństwo ukraińskie, zmieniłoby sytuację strategiczną Ukrainy.
Although this kind of European economic integration might be very difficult, but at least this integration with NATO to secure Ukraine and provide security for Ukrainian state might be much easier if we use this way of using backdoors to enter at least NATO.
To tylko pokazuje, że istnieje cały szereg możliwości, jak rozwiązać ten dylemat, który jest dylematem strategicznym, mianowicie właśnie włączenie Ukrainy w system bezpieczeństwa NATO.
This shows how the strategic dilemma of accession of Ukrainian accession towards NATO might be quickly solved.
W każdym z tych wariantów Polska staje się strategicznie kluczowym państwem nie tylko regionu, ale całego systemu bezpieczeństwa europejskiego.
In each variant, Poland becomes some kind of a core state according to the strategic situation and some kind of a most important state, not only in this part of Europe, but also for the international security system in the region.
I tu na koniec chcę wrócić do pozycji, która jest absolutnie klasyką myśli geopolitycznej, znaną zarówno w Rosji, jak i w Niemczech. Wszyscy w zasadzie klasyczni i współcześni geopolitycy odwołują się do Halforda Mackindera jako człowieka, który odegrał bardzo istotną rolę w poszukiwaniu systemu bezpieczeństwa europejskiego.
This is a kind of a classical concept by Harold Mackinder, the classical geopolitics. All modern and classical geopolitics are referring to his idea here.
Mackinder w swojej książce Demokracja demokratyczne ideały a rzeczywistość przedstawił właśnie podobną sytuację, z jaką mamy dzisiaj do czynienia, jeśli chodzi o Polskę i Europę Środkową, jako propozycję strategicznego bezpieczeństwa Europy, przy czym on mocno podkreślał, że ten obszar Trójmorza, łącznie z Ukrainą, powinien być lewarowany przez Stany Zjednoczone, czyli powinien być mocno wspierany przez Stany Zjednoczone i z tego typu sytuacją mamy w tej chwili do czynienia.
We are dealing with the situation which was presented by Mackinder in his classic book, Democratic Ideals and Reality, when Poland's and Ukraine's union can be kind of a guarantee, a warrant for strategic security of Europe, but of course it must be enhanced by the United States.
Ta koncepcja Mackindera była efektem jego rozmów z Piłsudskim, a więc można powiedzieć, że wracamy do punktu wyjścia, do bodaj najciekawszej właśnie koncepcji strategicznego bezpieczeństwa całej Europy.
This concept was born out of the talks of Mackinder with Piłsudski, so we are coming back, let's say, back to the future, to this strategic concept of security in Europe.
Dziękuję.
Thank you very much. Okay, thanks a lot. Now we have our last panelist, Dr. Andrzej Anders, and then we will go to questions and answers and comments. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will move our discussion towards a bit different area, but keeping in touch with Ukraine, as my area of expertise is rather Far East and China. But as we are looking into what happens now, we can see very much that China is an important factor when we are discussing about Ukraine. And first of all, perhaps I would like to thank my previous speakers, because I agree very much that we need culture, understanding of culture. We need understanding of history, of the past, to be able to discuss about the present. I agree also with Professor that we cannot copy directly. This is not possible. But without this knowledge, we are also not able to make, let's say, statistical predictions. This both things must be there. And for me, I would start to one point. For China, the modern policy is that China wants what they call, and I think this is rightly, national rejuvenation. They want to take place which they think is rightfully theirs. And to tell why, let's say if we take 1800, the year 1800, where already China was in decline, the Chinese participation in global gross product was 30%. In around 1950, in a lowest moment, it was a bit above 5%. Nowadays, it's about 20 something, depending on which moment we check. Still quite a lot to go. So from the historical perspective, the relative position of China is still weaker than it could be if we look into the past. Whether they can go, what does it mean for us? It's another story, but this is how they perceive. They perceive they have the right to develop, to be stronger, whether we like it or not. And when we come to the war in Ukraine, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine directly and its geopolitical significance, China has two outlooks. One is a local, directly Russia and Ukraine. And I would say that in this local aspect, if you look into the Chinese media, they may be even some sympathy towards the Ukraine. But if we look into another layer from the Chinese national interest, they perceive the war between Russia and Ukraine not as a war between Russia and Ukraine, but as a conflict between Russia and the United States. And this is the key point. For them, Ukraine is not independent, but is a pawn of the United States. And I would say, I checked more even about Poland. You can see very much. They understand perfectly why Poland supports Ukraine. If you look into the Chinese text about Polish giving tanks, giving, I don't know, political support, basically it's very okay. They understand we are afraid of Russia, Russia occupied Poland, blah, 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 blah. But if we move a bit further, suddenly this is, United States wants to harm Russia, Russia is a victim. So depending which level we take, we have a very different outlook. And we should be very conscious of that. From my point of view, this is both a threat and a chance for us to what if from our Polish perspective, local, if we want to support, let's say, Ukraine, we must disentangle in a way from the Chinese perspective, the conflict, the fate of Ukraine with the fate of China, United States rivalry. As the stronger there is a connection between China, between Russian conflict and position of United States, the more China is looking into that, not as a poor Ukrainians, but as Russians which are dominated by United States, which is a different approach. And there are several ambivalences in Chinese position. First of all, technically speaking, if we look very closely, the situation with Donbass, which is formally a part of Ukraine, legally part of Ukraine, which at least in 2013 had a very strong objections into being this Ukraine, how it was created with the help of Russia, is in a way similar to what we can say with Taiwan. We have a Taiwan, which is formally part of China, but is actually has a separate government and doesn't want to be part of China as it is now. So supporting Russia, taking away Donbass is a bit like giving ammunition for United States to take away Taiwan. That was at the beginning, China was putting a lot of Taiwan and Donbass is not the same. This was like actually covering that it is very much the same. So even nowadays, if we look into the so-called Chinese peace proposal, the peace proposal strikes very much the territorial integrity, because territorial integrity from Chinese point of view means Taiwan is China. Doesn't matter whether it's already controlled by a communist government from Beijing. This is secondary. but it's part of China. And here I would like to go into 2 points. One is, will China help Russia directly? There is a lot of talk whether they will provide weaponry. In my opinion, it is unlikely, with one exception. When China will be pressed so much from the outside that it will be considering, we have sanctions now, we are in a bad situation, we have nothing to gain by not providing, but we can perhaps gain something if Russia wins. Please look from the Chinese point of view. There is like talking, United States says, don't provide weapons to Russia, or you will face consequences. But what actually happens? Even if they are not providing, there are already sanctions for chips, for other products. In my opinion, if this pressure goes too far, it's actually not preventing, but actually making the probability of providing weapons higher. And from this point of view, actually, the highly controversial visit of President Macron in China paradoxically can do more to prevent providing weapons by Chinese to Russians than the pressure from United States, because it gives like this stick and carrot attitude. You cannot offer only stick. The carrot is also, especially not to the power like China, which is too big to be afraid of just sticks. The carrot is also important, in my opinion. And the second, what I would like to stress, in my opinion, is, and it's also have impact for us here, is the policy of United States. From the United States policy, what is stressed all the time, China is the biggest challenge. Actually, Russia, the Russia, especially with the troubles it has now already in Ukraine, is just an inconvenience, I would say. This is not a crucial enemy in the long term. Yes, it may take shorter, it may take longer. Actually, from the United States point of view, the longer the war in Ukraine is, in a kind of like, the more Russia bleeds, better, because this gives them leverage. But the enemy is China. And if we look into mass media, I think that there is a lot of pressure, a lot of effort from the United States side to combine China and Russia as one element, to make what happens in China and Russia as one. That China and Russia, because they are autocratic, because they are non-democratic, because this is dangerous, they want something, we want to put it as one. Why? At this moment, at least in the Western world, Russia is evil incarnated, or kind of, let's say, evil incarnated. This is the bad one. If we can put this bad image on China, it helps the policy of the United States to encircle China, to contain China. From my point of view, this is very understandable for the United States, and it's much more complicated from our perspective. For us, we are not, China is far away. I not fully agree. This is something which we can put in discussion about non-discussion with non-democratic regimes. The good example would be, I think, Saudi Arabia, for up to quite recently as an ally of the United States. But this is much more complicated, in my opinion. Not that I will be happy about non-democratic regime, but it is not that simple, democratic, non-democratic. This is what I think the United States wants to achieve. And China is already discussing a counter-narrative, since, of course, China cannot present itself as a democracy in the Western sense. This is impossible. This is not. But there are strong voices within China, Chinese academia, Chinese-like kind of mass media, to try to change the playing field. Not democracy versus autocracy, but those who develop and those who don't. Those who give better perspective for their citizens and those who doesn't. Let's say that in recent decades, China basically eradicated extreme poverty. They moved hundreds of millions of people from poverty to from extreme poverty to poor, but poor, not extremely poor, or even a middle class. Let's say the Western research show that over 60% of Chinese population believes that within 5 years they will be better off. Their personal life, their financial standing, their comfort will be better 5 years forward. For Western countries, I mean Western Europe, this old Europe and United States, it moves, but let's say average is a bit above 20%. And this is something which I think is important, that we cannot just forget about it. People in China support government because they think it provides them what they want. And if we look from this perspective, the field is different. And there are voices, and I think you can see it in Chinese propaganda, try to move the discussion from democracy, understood especially in a Western tradition, in Anglo-Saxon tradition, as so-called negative liberty. Because this is into which government provides better standards of living. You can say this is an old, maybe a bit simplifying, an old discussion between negative liberty and positive liberty, what actually liberty means. And that's why I'm not very fully agreeing with Mr. Dean about this democratic, because this is a more profound question, I think, what we are looking at. So if we do these two parts, I think from our perspective, we must, especially as Poland, we are in Poland, I would discuss it from Polish perspective. For us, what I would look into is we obviously must stay with the United States military because of the conflict for Ukraine. There is no discussion about it. But we should not follow USA blindly. And whereas I think, again, discussing the Macron's initiative about putting Europe versus United States, this is not a good idea. I think this is going too far. But getting this kind of own area of play, that we have our own interests, which are not the same as USA interests, this is reasonable. This is where we should stay and discuss, in my opinion. As for prediction, I think that whether the China will become a global power like player fully comparable with the United States, we don't know it yet. There are too many factors to be sure, to tell it for sure. It's highly probable, but it's not we cannot tell it for sure at this moment. There are recent surveys saying that out of 44 key R&D areas, China is dominant in 37, with the rest being United States. So this shows where potentially the power is, but this is potential. This is not yet executed, let's say. And whether it will be executed, it depends on many factors. For me, the key point is whether the China will be able to restrain its nationalist side, which was very much strengthened within the last 30 years to legitimate the party. The party is mostly legitimized on standard of living and nationalism, this national rejuvenation, not Maoist ideology. There are some social elements, but this is kind of like building this welfare of the state rather than Maoist per se or communist per se. But versus American pressure to do something with Taiwan. The longer China is not willing to act or is resisting to act to cross this border for war, the position of China will be stronger. With each year, China seems to be developing faster than the United States. There is a chance it will overcome. Chance, not fully executed. At this moment, the conflict, except for being a global catastrophe, will for sure stop the development of China. There is, even if China takes over Taiwan, the price will be probably too high. But the question is, and this is something which is very hard to predict, not just rational analysis, because also what I think is very important within is not only what people think and this is where part of this opening remarks, but also what people feel, how people react. Sometimes we know we shouldn't perhaps do something, but we do anyway, for any reasons. And this is an open question, which I think nobody at this moment except Xi Jinping himself is able to answer. We don't know it. We can predict a system. We can try to predict a system. We cannot predict a person. This is also something which is impossible. And this is a thing which I think I will not dare to tell whether he will be able to resist. And maybe this would be, to sum up for the moment, it's something more in a later discussion.
Okay, thank you very much for your interesting remarks. And we have a wide variety of topics, subjects, and perspectives here. Now we are moving to this question and answer sessions, but Timo was asking us to have a possibility to present 2 slides, last slides, so please do it now, and then we can move. If anybody is having questions, maybe I will give some kind of premiership to the panelists. If panelists are having some questions towards each other, please do, and then we can open the discussion for the public.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Machnikowski. And I have 2 slides. I would ask help from David to show these 2 remaining slides, which actually reflects to the previous speakers' comments quite nicely. Only the 2 last slides. This one. There has been quite a lot of discussion today about the impact of war, not only to Ukraine but also to Europe. And I would like to reflect these 2 slides. This one describes the ports of Ukraine during the war. So the losses of Ukraine, which Ukraine has suffered when it comes to the port capacity. And you can see that there are only actually 3 ports, seaports, which Ukraine can use at the moment without the risk. And so most of the seaports have been either destroyed, occupied, or they are under the constant risk of the warfare. So you can see the massive losses over here in this slide.
Yes, it's all recorded and it will be on YouTube.
The next slide, please.
Say something about China.
So here is the other slide. I would like to show the losses which Ukrainian economy has been suffering during the war. Actually, I would like to remind that this year in the autumn, from my account, the war and the aggression has lasted 10 years. So you can put to the perspective the losses, $6.4 billion losses, direct losses for the largest Ukrainian enterprises. There is one company among the others I would like to highlight, and that is the Philip Morris in Kharkiv, which has suffered roughly $150 million losses during the war. And during the first stage of the proxy war, which lasted from 2014 until last year, I kept thinking that the Kharkiv region would be saved from the direct warfare. And why so? And my theory was that was because that's full of industries owned by the Western companies, including the Philip Morris factory in Kharkiv. There are also a lot of Finnish companies, which is quite interesting. The Finnish metallurgy industries have penetrated to the Kharkiv markets, and of course, at the moment, most of the facilities have been destroyed or wiped down. And so this was my theory, but now I have to change the theory. And of course, Kharkiv has been pretty much devastated, and that devastation reminds me about the historical devastation what the Russians were conducting in the Baltic Peninsula during the long time ago during the Livonia War. So destroying all the civilized infrastructures and destroying the livelihood. So this is just a short introduction and intervention, and I don't want to take too much time here because there are a lot of panelists, but I was very much inspired by the previous presentations, not least about the discussion about Polish-Lithuanian Union, because that resembles what I'm now witnessing in Latvia, the discussion about Estonian-Latvian Union and the Livonian heritage. So maybe this war will inspire us to go a little bit beyond the mainstream. So I finish here, Mr. Chairman, and if there are any questions also, I'm happy to answer that. Thank you.
Just, okay, Mr. Kosi, please.
I actually have a question to my fellow countrymen. You mentioned that the Islamic terrorists can only carry out attacks on their soil, which they call Dar al-Islam. But correct me if I'm wrong, I'm talking under your control. There are also Dar al-Harb, which is mean the world of war, and Dar al-Hudna, which is basically means that the world of a ceasefire. But there is no, there is no written information about which country is the Dar al-Islam. For example, all countries where the Muslims are majority is considered by default as Dar al-Islam. But for example, in Russia, they have more than, I believe, 10 or 12% of Muslims. Will it be possible for example, to consider this country as a Dar al-Islam or not?
It's it doesn't work this way. The people wish to sacrifice their life for their cause, for their religions. They have a threat that if their intention is not sanctioned by God, they will not go to heaven, they will go to hell. So each time, including 911, you have a religious person who is asked if the goal is right and if the mission will be sending me, the believer, to paradise or to hell. This happened especially for 911, for the attacks against New York and Washington. 2 days after the attack, that is too late to interrupt anything because it was done. A suitcase was found in a hotel in New York. And in this suitcase, you had a text of about 10 to 12 pages, who was the fatwa, the religious order to authorize this attack. Of course, the text didn't contain in writing the name of the airports and the fact that it would be an attack on plane, but it was very close to it. The fatwa was signed by a highly important religious member of the Sunni board of overseer of the zone around Mecca, that is the Haram, the place where no state on earth has authority. This place, 40 kilometers around Mecca, is a place only where the religious order rules. I had a discussion with a very close advisor of King Abdullah before King Salman, and he told me that one day I was joking, said that would put an Arabic dress and go to Haram. He says, please, my friend, don't do this because you will be beheaded, and the king cannot help you more than if you were on the moon. So you have this sacred place where it's even impossible to break a flower or kill an animal. You know, it's a sacred place and only the religious power. And inside this area, somebody, it is unknown to this day, signed the fatwa authorizing the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. what was in this fatwa? First, the fatwa said that it was some kind of a military commando operation, a raid, Khaswa, Rezu in colloquial Arabic. And that it was possible to do such an act because the Prophet himself had done attack of his enemies when they were fighting between tribes. For the most conservative part of Sunni Islam, the most gravest sin is innovation. You should not innovate. What the Prophet has done is legal. What he has not done, what he refused to do, what he didn't condone is haram. It's forbidden. So, first, the Prophet had done such a raid. In this time, the Prophet used the necessary means. That is, he was on the back of a camel, but today, if the state of civilization is that you have planes, okay, you can use a plane for it. But then you have conditions, and the fatwa gave all the conditions one after the other. In order to participate in such a sacrificial mission, you must be totally pure of any sin. You must forgive your enemy. If you have a debt, being a sentimental debt or a financial debt, it should be paid before you leave. And this is the reason why the day before they took the plane, the night before they died, they sent back the money to an Islamic bank in Sharjah because they had $70,000 left and they must go to sacrifice totally white, totally pure, and send the money back. And so they should shave, they should perfume themselves, they should do as the Prophet did when the Prophet entered a mosque. He entered always with the right foot first and not the left foot. So they must respect all the rules, and then the end of this fatwa is terrifying. Your last words on this earth will be Allahu Akbar, and you will see God in the next minutes afterwards. So it was, each time it's different because there is no clergy in Sunni Islam. In Shia Islam, you've got Hujjat al-Islam, you have Ayatollah, great Ayatollah, etc. It's like, for Shia Islam, it's like the Catholic Church, except they have no Pope. They have only archbishops, great Ayatollahs. But they never could agree to one city like Rome. They have Qom and Mashhad too. So it stops at the archbishop, but it was never unified. First point. Second point, the rules between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam are different. For instance, in Shia Islam, in the southern part of Lebanon, they authorized, it's another success for feminism for the girls here, they authorized women sacrifices on suicide mission. Sunni Islam rejects it. And of course, Shia Islam accepted sacrificial missions, for instance, in Argentina, when they send a suicide car to the Israeli embassy and to the building of the Jewish community. But basically, a part of Lebanon, one or two times in Iraq, each and every suicide mission was by Sunni Muslims, and what I told is true for Sunni Islam. They think that basically suicidal missions should be done on because as suicide is forbidden, there is a rule saying that you can sacrifice your life if the loss of your life is compensated, but minimum 2 in the camp of the enemy. So that rule can be only respected in the Dar of Islam. Mostly, this is it. But of course, those are the broad rules, and on the ground, so to say, each time it differs because there is a legal religious authority who has to give a fatwa saying, yes, you should, no, you should not, and if it's illegal, you have to do this and that. Am I clear?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions? Yes, so we have two questions, Mr. Schmeichelson.
Yes, I have two questions. If it's
Yes, sure.
So, Dr. Anders, do you think that war in Ukraine can evolve or expand to a point which can really